At 22, Benedict Allen came to the Amazon chasing a legend, El Dorado, the kind of myth that turns boys into explorers. He hired two guides, picked up a stray dog, and pushed deeper until a miner's help became a whispered plan to cut his throat. He fled alone into the river-dark jungle. Weeks later, malaria, starvation, no map, no way out, only a machete, a compass, and the friend who followed him. To live, he'd have to cross a line he never knew existed and carry it home.
Benedict arrived in the Amazon with the kind of conviction that only the young can carry without irony. He was 22, long-limbed and restless, the sort of person who had grown up reading about men who walked into blank spaces on maps and came out as names in books. His father had been a test pilot, an occupation that, to a boy watching planes carve white lines above a suburban roof, looked like an everyday form of bravery. Benedict wanted that same gravity in his life, the sense that he could choose something difficult and be changed by it, then return home with a story that proved he'd been alive in a way most people weren't. The Amazon, sprawling across a continent like a living weather system, offered the purest version of that fantasy. It wasn't a single jungle so much as a million interlocking jungles, rivers braided with tributaries, forests stacked in layers, heat rising in slow, wet waves. The air itself felt heavy, as if it had mass. Benedict told people he was following old legends, El Dorado, the city of gold, the myth that had drawn explorers and con men into the green maze for centuries. He didn't claim he expected to find streets paved with treasure. What he wanted was simpler and more dangerous, to find himself by losing himself. Early on, the forest obliged. It swallowed distance. It bent time. Days were measured less by miles than by effort, how far you could push through vines, how long you could endure the insects, how many times you could soak your clothes in sweat and rain before they ceased to feel like clothing at all. Benedict wasn't equipped for this place in any honest sense. Not at first. He had enthusiasm, a machete, and the kind of romantic stubbornness that looks like strength until it meets a reality that doesn't care. He hired two local guides because he understood, at least intellectually, that the jungle was not a landscape you could simply wander through and improvise. The guides moved with a quiet competence that bordered on magic. They saw food where Benedict saw leaves. They heard patterns in the noise. They knew which plants would save you and which would blister your mouth, which trails belonged to animals, which belonged to people who didn't want to be seen. Benedict depended on them completely, and the dependence was humiliating and comforting at the same time. It meant there was an order to this chaos, an order he could borrow. Somewhere along the way, a dog attached itself to him, a stray, mangy at first, ribs faintly visible beneath its coat. In any other setting, it would have been a nuisance. In the Amazon, it became a kind of moving warmth, a presence that made the solitude less total. Benedict named the dog Kashu. He said it meant dog in a local language, which was either true or a story that felt true enough to carry. What mattered wasn't the etymology. What mattered was that Kashu followed him, slept near him, watched him with an alertness that felt like loyalty. In the jungle, where you could spend hours without seeing another human being, that small companionship mattered more than logic would suggest. For 3 months, Benedict and the guides pushed deeper into the interior, aiming toward a region rumored, by maps, by talk, by the kind of hearsay that thrives in remote places, to lie near the old El Dorado story. The farther they went, the more the forest felt occupied by invisible forces. Not spirits, not in any mystical sense, but people, illegal miners, men who moved into the jungle for quick money and stayed because the jungle could hide them. Benedict had been warned. These weren't harmless prospectors. They were the kind of desperate that turns violent easily. He began to notice signs, trash that didn't belong,
Empty bottles, cheap rum, boot prints where there shouldn't have been trails. The unsettling realization that in a place this enormous, alone was sometimes an illusion. One evening, as the light drained out of the canopy and the forest became a dim chamber of shadows, they stumbled into a rough settlement, makeshift structures, scattered gear, the blunt ugliness of human intrusion. Benedict felt the hair rise on his arms. His guides, oddly, were curious. One picked up an object, an opener, something metal, and turned it in his hands as if studying a tool from another world. Benedict wanted to leave immediately. The settlement didn't feel neutral. It felt like an ambush waiting to happen. A man emerged, Mendez. Benedict later described him as a typical miner, though typical in the Amazon can mean a lot of things. Hard eyes, quick smile, the practiced friendliness of someone who knows how to read outsiders. Mendez spoke with confidence. He asked questions. He offered help. He warned them that the river ahead was dangerous, rapids, strong currents, but said he knew a route, a path that could take Benedict back toward the outside world. He could guide them downstream and put them on the right line. It was, on the surface, exactly what Benedict needed: direction, certainty, a way through.
Benedict wanted to believe him. That's what the jungle does to you. It makes any offer of clarity feel like salvation. He agreed to the plan. The decision was not irrational so much as human. Fear, exhaustion, and hope braided together into a choice that looks obvious in hindsight only because hindsight isn't sweating in the dark. That night, sleeping uneasily near the river, Benedict woke with the sense that something was wrong. Not a sound, not a specific threat, just the feeling of a room changing after you've turned off the lights. He put on his boots and walked down to the riverbank to check the canoe. The air was thick. The forest was never silent, but the noises felt closer now, more intimate. Somewhere nearby, he heard voices, Mendez and others, speaking in low tones. Then he caught enough words to freeze him. Why not cut his throat now? Why not do it while he's sleeping? Would the indigenous men care? Would anyone care? In that moment, Benedict's fantasies about being an explorer collapsed into something animal and immediate. The adrenaline hit like electricity. He didn't argue with himself. He didn't try to interpret. He understood with a clarity that bordered on calm. They were going to kill him. Maybe for gear. Maybe because he'd seen too much. Maybe because that's what men do when the world has no rules and you're inconvenient. He ran. He ran for the canoe and shoved it into the water, hands clumsy, heart hammering. Kashu leapt in after him. Benedict paddled into the darkness as fast as he could, the river pulling at the boat, the jungle closing in on both sides like walls. He expected shouts, gunfire, pursuit. He heard nothing, only the slap of water and the relentless, indifferent chorus of insects. The relief he felt was sharp and short-lived, because it was immediately followed by a worse realization. His guides were gone, and with them went his map to survival. By morning, the river had carried him into a landscape that looked identical in every direction. Green, dense, impenetrable. The forest wasn't a backdrop, it was an organism. Without the guides, Benedict had no reliable sense of where he was, or where the exit might be. The river that had saved him from Mendez now threatened to become a conveyor belt into deeper isolation. He knew enough to understand the scale of his ignorance. He was not a skilled jungle traveler. He was a young man with a machete and a dream that had turned predatory. He tried to regain control the way people do when they're frightened, by making plans. He told himself the river could lead somewhere. Rivers, after all, connect places. He began moving upriver, because in his mind, upriver meant toward higher ground, toward something that might cut across to the outside. The decision may have been wrong. It may have been his only decision. In the Amazon, those can be the same thing. The river fought him immediately. Rapids appeared, white water snarling around rocks, currents that grabbed the canoe and tried to spin it sideways. Benedict hauled the canoe by rope along the bank, slipping in mud, hands burning raw where the line bit into his skin. Every rapid felt like a test he hadn't trained for. He kept thinking the worst would end after the next bend. It didn't. The rapids kept coming in a chain, as if the river were designed to punish persistence. By the third day, his body was already failing in small ways. His palms were shredded. His shoulders ached. His legs trembled from pulling and pushing. More dangerous than the physical damage was the erosion of confidence. He wasn't running out of food yet. He was running out of belief. That kind of hunger is harder to fix. Late on the third day, he reached what looked like calmer water and began to paddle again, relieved. Then the current shifted. The canoe began sliding backward toward another set of rapids. He dug in his paddle. He tried to angle away. The river ignored him. The canoe struck something, rock, submerged wood, and the hull cracked with a sound that felt final. Then he was in the water. The river is a violent thing when it wants to be. It tumbled him, filled his mouth, stole his breath. He fought to reach the bank, choking, kicking, grabbing at roots. He made it to shore and collapsed, coughing water, shaking. When he looked back, the canoe and most of his supplies were gone. Rice, sugar, dried meat, mosquito netting, hammock, the basic comforts that had separated hard travel from death spiral. Worse, Cashew was nowhere. The dog had vanished in the chaos. Benedict sat on the riverbank and understood, with a cold clarity that didn't feel like panic yet, that his expedition had ended and his survival had begun. There is a difference. One is voluntary, the other isn't. He inventoried what remained: a backpack, a bottle, a machete, a small survival kit, fishing line, a compass, a few emergency flares. A handful of objects suddenly responsible for his continued existence. He told himself that staying by the river would kill him. He would starve or get sick or simply collapse. Nobody would look for him for weeks. His trip wasn't supposed to end for months. The jungle could swallow him, and no one would even know where to start. So he chose the most direct plan available to a mind desperate for simplicity: walk straight out. He estimated the distance to the outside world at around 160 kilometers. The number had a crispness that comforted him. He decided to count his steps, mark progress on sticks, make the vastness manageable by reducing it to arithmetic. He drew a map from memory on a scrap of paper. It was less a map than a prayer. Then he stepped off the riverbank and into the trees. The jungle on foot was different, thicker, more intimate, more suffocating. Light filtered down in weak sheets. The air was wet enough to drink. Every surface seemed to cling. He hacked forward with the machete, muscles burning, sweat pouring, feet sinking in leaf litter that hid roots and holes. Hours passed in a slow-motion battle against vegetation. Movement was measured in meters. The forest did not open. It resisted. Night fell quickly beneath the canopy. Temperature dropped. Benedict tried to build shelter using techniques he'd watched his guides use. A lean-to of branches and leaves. A fire if he could manage it. He was proud of the small structure until he lay down and realized the ground itself was wet. Moisture rose into him. His clothes never dried. Then the insects arrived. Without a net, he was exposed to the jungle's most efficient killers, mosquitoes carrying parasites. Benedict feared malaria the way a man fears fire. He could feel the bites landing, each one a small injection of uncertainty. Morning brought no relief. It brought more heat, more sweat, more work, the same green wall in every direction. Benedict walked until exhaustion forced him to stop, then spent precious energy making fire, boiling water, drying clothes that refused to dry. He built traps to catch small animals, copying what he'd learned, arranging sticks, guiding a rodent through a narrow corridor, setting a weight to fall. The traps took time. Nothing came. It wasn't just hunger now. It was humiliation. The jungle seemed to be watching him fail.
Days blurred. He ate shoots and whatever plants he dared. Never enough. His muscles softened. His steps shortened. Insect bites swelled and some became infected, oozing, angry. The jungle was not romantic anymore. It was an engine designed to grind down the unprepared. By around day 11, he had covered perhaps 40 kilometers, only a quarter of his intended distance. His mind began to slip into a narrow loop. Move, cut, sweat, stop, shiver, itch, repeat. The cycle felt endless. He began to understand how people go mad in wilderness, not in dramatic screaming fits, but in the slow erosion of meaning. When every day is identical, hope becomes hard to defend. Then he found berries on a tree, dark, ripe-looking, and remembered his guides making a purple cream from similar fruit. Food meant energy. Energy meant movement. Movement meant escape. He ate greedily, drank the juice, felt relief as his stomach filled. For a brief moment, he felt almost euphoric, but his body, weakened and malnourished, rebelled. The jungle does that too. It offers something that looks like salvation and makes it a trap. His stomach cramped. He became nauseated. Eating made him worse. He felt punished for trying. The food didn't solve the problem. It magnified it. Soon after, the fever came. At first, it was sweating that didn't match the heat, then chills that cut through him despite the humid air. His hands trembled. His thoughts came apart, difficult to hold in sequence. He recognized the pattern from warnings and stories. Malaria. In the Amazon, malaria is less a disease than a deadline. It chews through the blood, steals oxygen, turns the mind into a foggy room. Benedict was starving, exhausted, and now infected. The jungle had delivered the thing he feared most. He thought of his parents across an ocean, 8,000 kilometers away, unaware that their son was dissolving in a forest. In his weakest moments, he wrote words that sounded like a goodbye, not because he wanted to be dramatic, but because the mind reaches for ritual when it can't control outcome. He felt ashamed not simply that he might die, but that he'd brought it on himself. He understood, suddenly, how selfish his dream had been. He had come looking for a story and found the cost. The fever worsened. He moved slower. He hallucinated sounds, heavy steps, a presence in the brush. One night, he became convinced a jaguar was stalking him. In the Amazon, that fear isn't entirely irrational, but malaria makes the line between plausible and imagined thin. He fired emergency flares, bright bursts of light wasted into the canopy, more for comfort than rescue. Then he heard a whine. Cashew emerged from the darkness, thin, muddy, alive. The dog had followed him. How far? Benedict later believed the dog tracked him for 60 kilometers or more, which sounds impossible until you remember what dogs are. Machines built by evolution to find and follow, to endure for the sake of attachment. Cashew's return struck Benedict like a miracle, not in a religious sense, but in the sense that it restored a piece of the human world. There was someone, something, who understood he was suffering. The dog's presence gave him a reason not to lie down and let the fever win. It made survival feel slightly less absurd. But companionship does not cure malaria. Days continued. Benedict's body deteriorated. He lost weight rapidly. His water needs increased while his ability to find clean water decreased. He drank more often, boiling when he could, sipping when he couldn't. Dehydration crept in, dry mouth, dizziness, the desperate urge to lick leaves, stones, anything that might contain moisture. He and Cashew drank from puddles like animals. Benedict felt his dignity peel away, layer by layer, until survival was all that remained. By around day 20, he had covered roughly 110 kilometers. The number should have encouraged him. Instead, it terrified him, because the pace had slowed dramatically. Cashew lagged behind, exhausted too. Benedict's mind began to turn toward a thought he hated: food. Not plants, not traps, meat, protein. Something that could put fuel back into a body being eaten from the inside.
And the only consistent source of meat beside him was his dog. At first, the idea was inconceivable. Cashew wasn't gear. He wasn't a resource. He was a friend, the one thing in the jungle that felt loyal, warm, real. Killing him would be a betrayal so total, it felt like erasing the last proof that Benedict was still human. But starvation has its own logic. It reduces morality into a series of desperate trade-offs. Benedict's fevered mind began to frame it brutally. Either he dies, or the dog dies. In the jungle, sentiment doesn't keep you alive. Calories do. The decision, when it came, did not feel triumphant. It felt like grief with a deadline. He approached Cashew from behind because he couldn't bear the dog's eyes. He swung the machete or struck hard. Details blur in the way trauma blurs. Then the dog collapsed. In Benedict's memory, the moment carried a weight that never left him. The instant he crossed from companionship into consumption. He built a fire and cooked the most nutrient-dense parts first: organs, heart, liver, because the survival part of his brain was still functioning even as the moral part was collapsing. He ate in silence, not celebrating, not savoring, only trying to stay alive. Then the jungle delivered its final cruelty. His body couldn't digest it. The malaria had wrecked his system. The meat came back up. The calories he'd killed his friend for did not stay inside him. The act that was supposed to save him became a pointless loss, and the weight of it nearly broke him. He had traded the last comfort he possessed for nothing.
By day 27 and 28,
Benedict was near the end. In advanced malaria, organs begin to fail. The mind slips. Coma comes. Death follows. Benedict felt terror not as a sudden shock, but as a rising tide. He knew, scientifically, practically, that his time was nearly up. Yet something in him still refused to surrender. He staggered forward in short bursts, then collapsed, then got up again, moving because movement was the only form of hope he had left. At some point, in the haze of fever and hunger, he saw something that didn't belong. A branch cut cleanly, not snapped by wind or animal. A human cut. Then another. It was the faintest breadcrumb trail, the smallest evidence of civilization, but to Benedict, it looked like a door. He followed the cuts, stumbling, pushing through brush, and suddenly the forest opened into something unmistakable. A path. A real trail, worn by feet, leading somewhere. The sight hit him with a flood of emotion so intense it felt like pain. He had been living inside a green prison, and here was proof that the prison had an edge. He walked, more fell than walked, until the path delivered him into a clearing that looked like a different planet. A garden, a small cabin, the straight lines of human intention. A man stood there, staring at Benedict as if a ghost had stepped out of the forest. That was the last thing Benedict remembered. The farmer recognized the symptoms: fever, delirium, skeletal thinness, and understood what the jungle was doing to this stranger. He took Benedict in, gave him water, kept him alive long enough for help to arrive. Days later, Benedict reached a hospital in Macapa, where modern medicine did what the jungle would not. It saved him. He recovered fully, at least physically. A week after that, he returned home to his parents, carrying a body that had survived and a mind that would never quite return to the person who had walked into the Amazon chasing legends. The story Benedict told afterward was not simply about endurance. It was about the cost of arrogance, about what happens when a dream is heavier than your preparation. The Amazon didn't care that he wanted to be an explorer. It didn't care that he admired his father. It cared only about biology and chance, and the thin margin between competence and catastrophe. He would go on to seek adventure again, jungles, deserts, ice, because that's what people like Benedict do.
They circle the site of their own transformation as if trying to understand it from every angle. But the core lesson remained fixed and ugly and true. In the forest, survival is rarely clean. It doesn't always produce heroes. Sometimes it produces a man who makes it out alive while leaving behind the one friend who followed him into the dark.